Yeah. I welcome the last minute opportunity to talk today about the naval heritage aspects of Osborne House at Geelong. The end to this tale has yet to be told, but I felt members might be interested in the early days of the story. And I'd like to acknowledge firstly the three key publications that I made reference to. The Eldridge Book. Eldridge was one of the senior members of the Naval College staff for many years and wrote a very comprehensive history of the Naval College from 1913 to 1949. Admiral Peter Jones's book, Australian Argonauts, which is the story of the first entry to the Naval College at Geelong. And then, because this has a submarine connection, also the book written by Dr. Michael White about the history of the RAN submarines, but particularly, of course, relating to the J class, which some of you have already heard me mumble about. I'm sure many of you would know of Osborne House. This slide is just a reminder of the location on the shore of Corio Bay in Geelong, and the two elements of the site which are of heritage importance to Navy. Osborne House itself, which is on the right of the screen, and on the left is the stables, the white buildings. I'll talk essentially about three elements of the history. Firstly, the 2 years during which it was home to the Royal Australian Naval College as the dark days of World War I were looming. Then the immediate post-war years when it became the headquarters and shore support facility for the RAN J-class submarines, which had been newly gifted to Australia. And finally, I'll talk about the Maritime Museum, which sits in those white buildings there, and the collection of memorabilia, some of which relates, no doubt, to the earlier times of the college. I'll finish by telling you what I know, as of today, of current intentions for the redevelopment of the site, noting that these have not yet been finalised or approved by the Council of the City of Greater Geelong. So, going back to 1913-ish, and a little background to its role as the Royal Australian Naval College. The house was originally built in 1858 for local pastoralist Robert Muirhead. He named his mansion after Osborne House, which was Queen Victoria's residence on the Isle of Wight. In 1900, the Victorian government purchased the house as a country residence for the Governor of Victoria, though it was never used as such. And then the Geelong Harbour Trust purchased it in 1905 for £6,000 and offered it to the Royal Australian Navy in 1911. This was when our fledgling Navy was determining where to establish training facilities for its officers and sailors, and it was decided that officer training would be conducted at a new RAN college to be built on Commonwealth land at Jervis Bay. Work at Jervis Bay started in 1913, but that was too late to accommodate the first entry of 13-year-old boys who would join as cadet midshipmen that year. So, as an interim measure, the government took up the Geelong Harbour Trust offer to use Osborne House as the inaugural Royal Australian Naval College to train its young officers. Those are the cadet quarters on the right-hand side of the view, at the rear of the building. The chimneys have obviously been removed in later years as alternative heating methods were introduced. But with relatively minor changes, Osborne House offered a good interim solution to accommodate young officer training until the Jervis Bay site was ready. This is the Pioneer class. After interviews around the country, the Naval Board met in Melbourne on the 4th of December 1912 to select the inaugural college entrance. This entry of 28 cadets, known as the Pioneer class, was chosen from 138 13-year-old boys who applied from all over Australia. This is the group later called Australia's Argonauts by Admiral Peter Jones in his substantial, fascinating book on their history. Unlike the Royal Navy, this was a deliberately egalitarian process. The boys' social position had no influence on selection. They were each assigned a number and were selected based on merit and anonymity. Only of those finally selected, only a quarter had received private school education, quite different to the way the entrance to the Royal Naval College took place, certainly at that time. I've highlighted there the young lads who came from Geelong. They were quite well represented with 3 out of 28. Interestingly, the 13-year-old entry to the college continued until 1955. And it was John Collins, who you can see in the centre here, who made the decision to cease this in favour of a 15-year-old entry. I was one. To better align our training with that of the Royal Navy entry and manning process. Although the cadets and staff had been in residence for a few weeks beforehand, the RAN College was officially opened with appropriate pomp and ceremony by the Governor-General, Lord Thomas Denman, on the 1st of March 1913. Prime Minister Andrew Fisher and head of the newly formed Royal Australian Navy, Rear Admiral Sir William Creswell, were also present. And their Excellencies and the official party made the journey to Geelong on board the new destroyer HMAS Warrego, escorted by sister ships Parramatta and Yarra. The 200 other invited guests from Melbourne arrived by a special train, motor cars and boats. The RAN College was to be commanded by Captain Bertram Chambers, Royal Navy, who had played a prominent role in selecting the Jervis Bay site. On his left was his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Duncan Grant, Royal Navy, retired, who, although quite deaf, had a profoundly positive influence on the cadets initially and in later years. In fact, Grant was promoted to commander and took over command of the college after Captain Chambers returned to England in April 1914. And he was later promoted to captain and again commanded the college at Jervis Bay from 1917 to 19. Not bad for a deaf old bloke. The campus layout, you'll see largely at the bottom of this slide. This is a sort of a legend that describes what occurs in each book. Down here at the bottom of the slide, that's Osborne House itself, as a tennis court. That was the cadets' quarters, B, in blue. That was, I'll come to it, I can't remember now. And then there were sailors' quarters over there. I can't remember my notes again. Yeah. Oh, that's right. That was the museum building, or the stables, and so that became all those training classrooms. And there's a couple of buildings down there on the left, on the opposite side of the road, which included the captain's house, the executive officer's house, the director of studies house, and some offices as well. £10,000 was spent on improvements to the buildings and equipment, which included alterations to the main building. That's A. That's in blue, to accommodate the 28 cadets. The 2 new classrooms in red, and the erection of a block of buildings, which is D, in green, for the unmarried seamen personnel who would man the base. And there's other key buildings which I've just mentioned, the stables and the director of studies house, etc. The cadets' dormitory, I only managed to source a couple of internal photos from the era. That's the cadets' dormitory. That large sea chest at the end of each bed, which stored all their possessions. I'm unsure how they coped for sleeping space when the second entry arrived in 2014. Looks a bit cramped. The engineering workshop was located in the old stables, which was also where seamanship was taught in a dedicated classroom. And there were only ever 2 entries to Osborne House, and this was the 1914 entry, which comprised 31 cadets. Excuse me. Here they are on parade in 1914. A little about their academic studies. They were extensive and demanding. They included English, French, German, mathematics, physics, chemistry, seamanship and gunnery, which they did in the cruiser HMAS Encounter, navigation, history, geography, Bible studies and engineering. I note that engineering always comes last in these things. They also had to master their drill and turn out spick and span, and here's a quote from Peter Jones's book. A typical summer's day for the cadets began with reveille at 7 a.m, followed by breakfast, a short parade before studies commenced at 9. Studies would continue until after lunch until 4:40, when there would be sport until 6 o'clock. After dinner, the cadets' accommodation would be inspected, and from 7:30 to 9:30 there would be homework, followed by cocoa and biscuits with lights out at 9:15. On Wednesday and Saturday afternoons, sports would commence at 2:15, while on Sundays there would be an hour of divinity studies, followed by divine service. Sunday afternoon was set aside for recreation. I have to say that routine was much the same when I joined the RAN College 50 years later. I emphasise the cocoa, or kai as it was known to many of us, that was provided before the cadets turned in. Rumour had it that when I was at the college, that this was laced with bromide, the effect of which was to suppress urges in young men. My contemporaries and I agree that it's begun to work. The earlier campus slide showed the captain's house, known as St Helens, located near the waterfront. It was possibly here that Commander Grant, as newly appointed captain of the college, penned his utmost sympathy to the parents of the brilliant young Otto Albert of the 1913 entry, who had died of meningitis at home in Sydney on the 15th of May 1914, having gone home for Easter. He was the first of the pioneer class to go, and his name is still perpetuated through a family trust that donates graduation prizes at the RAN College. This grand building later became the Stella Maris Convent of Mercy, and has recently been sold as part of a major redevelopment of the site. Carol and I visited and saw the house now being refurbished and restored. Sport would have been an important component of their training, presumably against local teams. What impressed me about this photo was how much bigger some cadets looked compared with others. Although an older cadet, young Dick Cunningham, who was in the centre rear there, seemed particularly short. Sadly, he was the first of their class to die while on active service. He was drowned in 1918 when the British submarine he was serving in was rammed. In fact, 9 of the 1913 class were sent to join submarines in England in 1917, the remainder going to larger warships. Another early tragedy occurred when Sub-Lieutenant Frank Larkins, who was the captain of the team there, shown here with the ship's the mascot, he was lost overboard from Her Majesty's submarine J2 on its way home back to Australia in 1919. He'd been sleeping on the narrow submarine deck, a practice used by some in hot climates due to the oppressive heat below, and must have slipped or been washed overboard unnoticed at night. He was never found. Their first year at Osborne House prepared these young men well for the relocation of the RAN College to Jervis Bay in 1915 and set them on career paths that were notable in peace and war. Distinguished graduates from the 1913 entry included Vice Admiral Sir John Collins, Admiral Harold Farncombe and Admiral Harry Showers, among others whose careers were notable in many ways. I recall that one of those Geelong cadets in the first entry was in fact the first commanding officer of the Bungaree, which I talked about more recent times. By 1915 the RAN had fully relocated to Jervis Bay. However, defence links in Osborne House continued during the First World War, when it was used as a military convalescent hospital and later as a rest home for war-torn nurses. The Geelong Harbour Trust prodded the Commonwealth regarding its plans for future use of the building after 1919. Defence decided to use it as a submarine base, and the Red Cross was moved out by January 1920. And so we moved to the second major phase of defence use when the property became the headquarters and the support base for the J-class submarines. These were built in 1915-16. These sleek submarines with 3 engines and 3 propellers were once the fastest in the world and could make 19 knots on the surface and 10 knots submerged. But after World War I, they became surplus to British requirements as new designs entered service and were gifted by the Admiralty to the RAN in 1919. That would ideally revitalise the service after the loss of the only 2 submarines, AE-1 and AE-2, during World War I. So between 1920 and 1924, Osborne House was to be used by the relatively young RAN submarine service as the flotilla headquarters for their 6 submarines. They'd be supported by HMAS Platypus, which had been ordered by the Australian government and built in England to be a depot ship for the Australian submarines. The 6 submarines sailed from Portsmouth to Australia in company with their support ship Platypus and escorted by the light cruiser Sydney. And after a few breakdowns on the route, they arrived in Sydney on the 10th of July 1919. It soon became evident that they were in a poor state of repair and they needed extensive refits. These inevitably took place in Sydney dockyards. After necessary repairs and return to service, the submarines and their mothership Platypus were moved to Geelong in February 1920, where the new submarine depot had been established with its shore support headquarters and crew accommodation at Osborne House. Dr. Michael White, in his book, identified that although the buildings and grounds were pleasant and gracious, some alterations were needed to accommodate several hundred men, so £40,000 was initially allocated for that work. Moreover, while the channel depth leading to the base was adequate, the depth of the water alongside the jetty was only 12 feet, too shallow for Platypus or the submarines to come alongside. So Platypus had to secure some mooring buoys off the end of the pier with the submarines berthed alongside it. After the flotilla was established in Geelong, further shortcomings were highlighted, primarily the need for an adequate pier so that they could get alongside and not have to move people backwards and forwards constantly throughout the day to take not only meals but to work. They needed a battery shed for the storage and maintenance of their batteries and a charging plant. They needed a torpedo store, workshop and air compressing plant and storage for other fittings and equipment. Those works were estimated to cost an additional £25,000 to £30,000, but it seems that this was never expended. Budget limitations meant the submarine's activities were mainly confined to conducting simulated attacks in Port Phillip. However, Australia had its first fleet review in Sydney in June 1920, with 12 ships and the salute taken by the Prince of Wales during his world trip of the battle cruiser HMS Renown. 4 of the J-class submarines sailed from Geelong to take part in this review. Having returned to Geelong from their exciting role in the fleet review in Sydney, it's hard to know if the crew of J5 understood what a perilous state the RAN submarine force would find itself in within the next year. They did enjoy one other excursion beyond Port Phillip when 4 boats and Platypus passage to Hobart in 1921 as part of a summer training cruise, followed by a visit to Sydney. But big cuts to defence spending sealed their fate in 1922. The subs were expensive to run, and generally the feeling in the government was that the country didn't really need them. They overturned that view a short while later. So initially 3 subs were laid up. Then in May 22, the Naval Board decided to abandon the policy of maintaining the Royal Australian Navy submarine service. The remaining 3 J-class boats in commission were paid off, and on the 1st of July 1922, Platypus proceeded to Sydney with the hulk of the old HMVS Cerberus, briefly assigned to take over floating berth duties at Corio Bay. The decision to scrap the submarines J1 to 5 was taken in late 23, following a cut in the defence budget by some £500,000. In the interim, a couple of the boats were used to provide electrical power during the construction of the naval base at Flinders. Eventually, they all went to the bottom for good. J1, 2, 4 and 5 scuttled outside Port Phillip and remained in dive sites for professionals. J5, J3 rather, was scuttled near Swan Island to act as a breakwater, and J7, though in relatively good condition after being most recently refitted, was described as the last survivor of an obsolete class. The decision to scrap her came in January 1924, but it wasn't until 1927 the government approved its final disposal. She was sold to a Melbourne firm for stripping of parts and then to Melbourne Ports and Harbours Department. She was finally towed to Sandringham to act as a breakwater, and she now lies in the shallow water at the Sandringham Yacht Club, surrounded by marine pens. Her bones can still be seen clearly today. So ended the second phase of Navy's use of Osborne House. The submarine force sailors dispersed to surface ships to alleviate manning shortages elsewhere, or sent to crew two later submarines acquired by the RAN. The Geelong Harbour Trust regained control of Osborne House in 1929 and eventually sold the premises to the Shire of Corio in 1937. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, the Department of Defence took over the premises to use it as an army training centre. Then in 1945, the Shire of Corio resumed control. In later years, some architecturally unsympathetic additions were made to the main building. Whether these will be retained in future is unclear at present. So let me touch on the final phase. From 1991 until recently, when the property was deemed uninhabitable, the stables housed what was later known as the Geelong Maritime Museum. This was operated largely by a team of volunteers. It's an eclectic array of naval and maritime artefacts that in some cases may be priceless. It's hard to know, but some undoubtedly relate to the history of Navy's earlier use of the site. The Vietnam Veterans Association was provided with club rooms inside the main building, which was also accessed periodically by the community groups. However, they all had to move out, and the council assisted in finding them their new homes after black mould was detected on the premises in 2017. The museum collection remains stored in the stables building. The director of the Wool Museum in Geelong, Mr. Patrick Fisher, has overseen the process of auditing the contents of the building. He tells me the audit's completed and reconciliation of the records is nearly complete, although there have been some delays due to complexities of records, inconsistency of previous record keeping and provenance verification. I understand the heritage consultants were to conduct, quote, significance assessments of all the items in the collection. From Navy's perspective, this will be an important process to better understand what items within the collection may be of heritage significance to Navy. A high-level report of findings and recommendations and future measures was due to be delivered to the Council in August. When the report is complete, it was intended that this be distributed publicly. We haven't seen it yet. Managing displays and making these items once again available for public viewing requires they be housed in facilities that meet contemporary museum standards, including climate control. It seems the Wool Museum in Geelong has this clearly in mind. The main house awaits a new phase of life. Although stripped of carpets and other interior fittings, it still retains many of its original elegant features. The City of Greater Geelong has recently carried out more than $500,000 worth of restoration works, including underpinning and stabilisation of the stable walls, followed by facade repairs and painting. The works also included repair and replacement of 40 windows, including these lovely stained glass windows, and more than 40 French doors throughout the main bluestone building. A new fire detection system featuring 23 detectors is now monitored off-site and linked with a security system while drainage has been installed in the car park. In committing to retaining public ownership of Osborne House, the Council has allocated a total of $8 million over the next 4 years towards the restoration and redevelopment project. An option for sale of the land and buildings is not being considered as part of the expressions of interest, given the Council's 2018 resolution to retain public ownership. The EOI process is concluded following a two-stage process with two interested parties the city is progressing to the final stage of the process with Gurner and Montgomery property. The final stage, which will include developing agreed commercial terms, designs and uses, is expected to take about 4 months to complete. So, in conclusion, I hope I've explained the three key elements that form the basis of Navy's continued interest in Osborne House and its surrounds. The Navy community in Victoria hopes that any future development of Osborne House would appropriately acknowledge the significant historical links to the Royal Australian Navy and other defence users in past years. For example, it might be appropriate to name more substantial rooms in the restored house after notable graduates from the pioneer class of 1913. We also hope that the artefacts in the museum will be appropriately curated to establish their heritage significance for the Navy, and the Navy historians, I think, can help with that if asked. As the birthplace of the Royal Australian Naval College, Osborne House will always have a prominent place in the history of our Navy. This short video provides some better exterior and particularly interior views of the present property. You may even hear footsteps of the ghost that reputedly haunts the upper floor of the building. I'll let that play in the background now for 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes or so, while I take any questions. Thanks for listening.
So, what is the ghost supposed to be the ghost of?
It was never really explained, but
A dead person, perhaps.
Very valuable contribution. Yeah.
Andrew, I've always wondered why, in some ways, they chose that as a site for a submarine base.
Yeah.
Because Corio Bay is actually very shallow. And I would have thought, I mean, it's not that long ago, I believe, that they used to, you know where Alcoa is, and the point that goes out, Point Henry, that they swam the cattle across there to the pastures. And I have a friend whose grandfather went to Geelong Grammar, and the actual building that all the boys slept in, you know, the boarding house was in East Geelong, and they used to have to walk down, or they took and catch a boat across to Geelong Grammar in the...
I don't know, but
I don't know, it just strikes me as a very odd choice.
they've got existing infrastructure there they didn't have to spend money on. The whole,
and you can't see that, you haven't got, but if you look there, you'll know that's too close. You actually see it's all bluestone where they actually had they used to tie the submarines up to.
I don't think the submarines ever tied up to anything because they had to be out alongside.
Alongside, is that right?
The wall, yeah.
Well,
They never built the wall for the
it's only
submarines
12
to
feet.
get onto. This was chosen over Western Port and New South Wales somewhere. Since basing them in Sydney, they really didn't have a lot of space to put them, and secondly, the water was too deep. When you're training submarines, you don't want deep water initially. You want to be in relatively shallow water, because if you have a problem, you want to be able to escape. And I think Port Phillip was seen as a good compromise. It was deep enough for them to go out and do exercises, do submerged attacks in and outside the bay, whilst within a reasonably safe water depth. I don't know why they didn't go for Western Port. At one stage they were thinking about Cerberus as a submarine base, but that never seemed to eventuate.
Thank you, that answers my question.
Yeah.
So the key point about it, deep water is not necessarily what you want for submarine training. They wanted deliberately shallow water in case there's an accident.
Sorry, on my view. So there was no training facility prior to Osborne House then for the naval officers?
No, that was it.
That was the initial.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure. Well, where did we train officers? Because sailors used to train on the Tingara, which was an old sailing ship.
There was the Victorian colonial ships.
Colonial ships had some sort
trained
of
officers.
training. They were old ships, tied up.
Well, that had bad officers, but certainly need.
81 and 82 only arrived just course, in World War One.
But they were mostly commanded and crewed by Royal Navy.
Yeah.
Yes, this is the birth of the RAN officer training system.
Right. It's just what interests me, those 13-year-olds certainly right now would be considered boys.
Yep.
How were they referred to then? I mean, obviously they were training, they were in uniform, they were men as far as I'm concerned.
It's interesting because I must have only given great little thought to it, but of course by the time they graduated they were 17 but still under 18 and they were going to war. There's a bloke over there who went to war when he was under 18 accidentally, i.e. the Navy wasn't smart to pick it up. But generally speaking, the Navy did not send people into combat zones until they were 18 years old.
That's spooky. That's the ghost.
There we are. Cyril the ghost deep down.
I think that's a ladybug.
Usually you won't give all the talking back. Yeah, look, I can't really answer that, and I'm not really sure quite how the Royal Navy treated these young men.
Days of sail,
We had boy seamen at sea at war in Nelson's day, so why wasn't it was good enough for him? I can't really answer the question as to why.
Just was out of interest.
Yeah.
I wonder how old boy Seaman Cornwall was. He was very
15,
famous.
I think.
World War
And they called him boy.
Yes.
They called them boys, didn't they? Yes, they did.
Boy Seaman.
You can right. I don't know what age they transitioned from boys to men, but we never called our cadet midshipmen, midshipmen boys. They were officers under training.
Yes.
You know,
Just a recent addition.
It's the ghost.
Yeah. Back in the days of sail, I've read some of those books on Hornblower and all those people. There were a few of the senior officers actually took their sons to sea as 12-year-olds. So they served as
London early, I say.
Or even possibly younger.
Yeah.
My father's service record I told you before.
Yeah.
He was in the Navy in 1919 and he was on the Planet Force in 1920. So he could well have been on leadership then. And so his Planet Force has been reused as a name in Sydney Harbour and other naval establishments. And that one of the many questions I'd like to ask you. He would have been 19 years of age then.
Well, I mentioned there that when they started to wrap up the submarine force and they brought the old service Hulk across to Corio Bay to act as an interim berthing arrangement, they sent the platypus to Sydney and she became the destroyer tender. I guess to support the various destroyers that were at the time. This is linked into the museum, but I mean, there are some amazingly beautiful ship models in here.
Yeah.
I don't know who made them, what they're of, no idea. But at some stage it would be nice to see that actually serves. I have to say, my sense is that the Corio Council is not excited about continuing to operate this as a museum. It's hard to know. There is a group who represent the previous volunteers who ran it. I went to their AGM the other day. It's the only meeting they ever have a year. And they're all a bit older. Past, but they're very keen to preserve everything. It can't change. It must always be like this. But I don't know. They don't. When it comes to asking the question, well, where's the money to do all this? If you start to talk about conserving museum items, climate control, all that sort of thing, it gets very expensive. And plus, you can't really run a museum properly unless you've got permanent staff. And I have to say that I'm an expert in museums. We visited the Queenscliff Maritime Museum some months ago, And that's really quite well done. You know, they have a permanent person on duty, and they've got quite a good collection. By the way, you mentioned him, John Wilkins is still gifting all his.
He has already.
Hasn't really, to the Queenscliff Maritime Museum. So, I don't know what the solution is. I have a sense that just having a museum full of maritime stuff various is not necessarily a particularly useful thing. On the other hand, Navy's got its own museum problems, as you well know. I mean, how much space have we got, and what do we need to keep? Then, of course, there's that wonderful, I think, potentially wonderful Seaworks Museum in Williamstown, which is it's got a lot of space, but not yet enough stuff, naval stuff particularly. So it's a real challenge. And the other thing that Patrick, whatever his name is, Fisher, who runs the War Museum in Geelong, told me about was, and not something I'd ever given much thought to, is that when it comes to disposing of stuff out of the museum, the first person you're meant to consult with is the person who donated it to the museum in the first place. Well, if they've shuffled off the mortal coil, then you've got to discuss with the family, you know, their offspring, if they've got them. And so that all takes time to research all that stuff if you do it by the book. And the third solution is then, well, that can't be found, and if the museum doesn't want to keep it, then they have to go out to other museums and ask if they'd like to acquire this stuff in their collection. And if they don't want it, then, you know, sadly, I don't know what happens. Does it go to the tip? Or do they sell it? Right. We're done.